Welcome to Breaking Down Bergman. I'm David Friend.
And I'm Sonia Strimban.
And this is the second part of our discussion of the film Scenes from a Marriage.
In the last episode, we left at a critical point where Marianne and Johan had actually split. He ran off to Paris with his mistress, and she was left feeling betrayed and abandoned. So when we came back to episode 4, A Veil of Tears, we really didn't know what to expect and how and if they would come back together. So fast forward 6 months later, Johan comes crawling back, essentially, realizing that he abandoned one cliche, a perfect marriage, for another one, which was the professor-student midlife crisis situation.
But when they regroup, both of them have discovered something about themselves. What Johan discovers is that he sees life as about loneliness and solitude, while Marianne concludes that life is about togetherness and connection. And you really start to see the differences that Bergman has presented here between the man and the woman.
I think I'm a little bit concerned about reducing it to all men and all women, and that's what he's trying to say. Maybe it's this man and this woman. We should think more about what do kind of Johan and Marianne represent as a unit or as two pieces apart, as opposed to, you know, they are the Adam and Eve and therefore the prototype for all of society.
Okay, I can agree with you to some respect on that, but it's hard to ignore just how important gender is in this film. And even Marianne addresses it in the expectations of what a woman should be, what she should do, how she should act, how she should think. She lays it out in her diary, for example.
That's true. She does. I think what's interesting with Marianne is that after she gets over the initial grief and shock, she really tries to seize this as an opportunity now that she is alone and kind of unfettered with the expectations of being a wife. She makes a very deep and strong attempt at trying to reconnect with her own natural self, because I think somehow she realizes that she wasn't being authentic. And with that realization comes the question of, who am I really? How have I become this person that I am today? What has influenced me and what motivates me to go forward? How shall I move on from this, you know? And yes, there's some expectations that she can't undo, like for example, the fact that she's a mother and she has 2 dependent children who happen to be both daughters, which means that there is a continuum here that Bergman is showing us of, you know, the creation of women or the constructedness of a female personality. And it's interesting that he shows us both the relationship between Marianne and her mother, and eventually in the next episode we actually meet her mother. And then there is Marianne's own consciousness of passing things on to her daughters. So she really tries to go through this process of figuring herself out.
Yes, I think it can't be emphasized enough just how much Bergman has created this generational lineage of women who have had different experiences, but all seem to be struggling with these same battles. And it does start with Marianne's mother.
The scene that Marianne had with her mother was very interesting because in a way she was kind of confronting her mother while at the same time looking for meaning. So she confronted her mother about the fact of how her mother had structured her own marriage and relationship with Marianne's father and whether that was authentic or not and why she continued that relationship on for so long. And she also slightly confronted her mother about the expectations and the framework that her mother had put on her and her own consciousness of herself. And then basically that she let her mother know that she's choosing a different path by being an individual, by being a more contemporary woman, and perhaps passing on a different legacy to her daughters. It was also an interesting mirroring of a much earlier scene at the beginning of the series where Marianne was sitting down with one of her clients, an older woman, who at a very late stage in life decided to get divorced and basically, you know, kind of restart her life or look for herself. And so Marianne had this dichotomy of these 2 older women who both served as models of women and what it meant to be wives, but they went in such different directions, and I think she was conflicted by that. Similarly, Marianne is conflicted about other structural elements of her own identity. So for example, with Johan, she constructed herself in reaction to him, and in his absence, she's forced in this abyss to kind of recreate herself. So she tries to use substitutes to do this, and when Johan does reappear, she, you know, even though she doesn't want to, she gets pulled in there kind of against her will. So one of the substitutes that she has in the meantime is a boyfriend, I guess, David. And it seems to be going really well until Johan reappears back in the picture and she immediately abolishes her relationship with David, basically indicating to us that she's still looking for that sense of authenticity, that resonance, and she hasn't quite found herself yet.
I find the relationship between her and David very questionable, though, because it almost seems like she's using him. Because once Johan comes in there again, she's deceiving David on the phone. She's sort of leaving him waiting. She's mistreating him like Johan mistreated her. So I don't really know if that justifies any of her actions, or maybe just puts her closer to what Johan was. I had a different response to this movie than you did. I didn't necessarily hate Johan anywhere near as much as you. In fact, I saw him just as flawed as Marianne. And you know, Marianne had her own struggles, but Johan clearly was going through his own dilemmas, often off the camera. You don't really see his relationship and how it developed with Paula. You can only assume the worst, which personally I think is what you did in many scenes.
Yeah, but the thing with Johan is that many of his troubles are self-inflicted, whereas I feel with Marianne, of course she's flawed, and we see a lot of her flaws quite clearly because, let's face it, it's Bergman's film. She's still more the victim than he is.
Why is that, though?
Maybe it's how it's presented to us, because he's the one that made the decision. He's the one that had the affair. He's the one that ran off. When she's trying to rebuild herself and normalize her life, he's the destabilizing element that keeps coming back in. Do you know what I mean?
So he chooses to leave the family.
Exactly. And I feel like he doesn't try. He's more self-centered and focused on his own, what I might say too is very petty objectives, versus Marianne, who thinks of herself as an individual with an opportunity to evolve and grow. And Johan is just always just lashing out in these tiny, mean little ways and not really progressing. And then he uses a lot of big concepts to try to justify why he just keeps spiraling further and further down. So he makes up dramas and conspiracies about his colleagues at work as to why he's not getting promotions. He cheats on his mistress with another mistress and then tries to justify the breaking apart of that relationship. He's just all over the place. He starts drinking. Like, it's just...
Okay, but the way that I see the battles here is that Johan is struggling against his instinct, and maybe the natural human instinct towards sexuality. While Marianne, on the other hand, is struggling with the constructs of society and the complete opposite, the instincts that have been taught to her, the way that she's been told to respond. So neither one of these people is really playing a fair game. They're fighting their own wars entirely separate from each other, and the fact that there is no proper communication, the fact that they are not connected as they ideally should be, neither one of them understands what the other person's going through. They don't even really try to understand what the other is going through because they're so caught up in their own forces.
I really like the war metaphor because I think it's quite apt. There's clearly a battle of wills that is happening here, and there's ongoing scenes from one episode to the next where there's push and pull and push and pull, and they're each coming at each other in these ways that just don't fit. One of my favorite scenes, actually, is in episode 5, where Marianne and Johan meet at his office in order to sign the divorce papers. And I like this scene for the sheer raw emotion that's in it, for the complexity of the dialogue.
Simplicity of the set is noticeable.
I completely agree. I think the set was just stunning in its starkness and how it framed the couple when they were sitting at the negotiating table, if you will. It was like two generals coming together in the field. And, you know, it's classic Bergman that he isolates them from everything. He takes away everything else, and it's like he puts us on that metaphorical island where a lot of his other couples hashed out their issues. And here we see a literal physical altercation between the two where everything starts to boil over, and you see the complete and utter rendering of that relationship. And through that strife, through the physical violence, the blood, it's like a purging of any remaining kind of attachments that were between them. And finally, in the 5th episode, a chance to potentially start anew, if they can do it.
They finally do sign the papers, but one thing that they note here is that they weren't able to resolve this in a constructive way. It took the fists and the blood. They acknowledge, at least Johan does, that they're emotional illiterates.
And I think that's one of the key themes of Scenes from a Marriage. Bergman is trying to tell us that life with another individual is really a series of events that we're supposed to learn things from. It's a learning experience. It's a journey, you know, however tacky that term sounds now. But you go on this journey with the other individual. You've signed the slot. You've thrown in your fortunes together. And the idea is that you learn from each other and you move forward. The fact that Johan here is admitting that they're both emotional illiterates, basically what Bergman is telling us, they never bothered to learn. And so now, past midlife, they're thrown into this situation where they're starting anew and they're completely unfamiliar with the curriculum.
But what have they really learned through this entire process? Because in the last episode, they're both married and they meet secretly in a shack, essentially putting them where they were when they were married, hiding secrets from their spouses, creating this faux passion, this excitement that is entirely constructed. They sit down, they discuss their relationship and learn that they totally misunderstood each other. Johan sees their first anniversary as the time that he had sex with Marianne for the first time. Marianne sees it as the time they got married. There's still this complete disconnect, and there's still all this messiness. And, the suggestion that this same mistake could be perpetuated in a new relationship and affect another person in the exact same way. Perhaps that we could jump back to the beginning of Scenes from a Marriage and watch the movie again. The exact same story.
But that's classic Bergman, right? I mean, he's not here to make us feel better about ourselves by watching some two puppet characters on a screen live through a happily ever after tale. Bergman is here to try to uncover the truths, to get at raw emotions, to try and understand the motivations of why we keep repeating the mistakes over and over. And I think for me, yes, it was disappointing to see them fall into some of their old behaviors, but what he's really trying to say is that there's always an opportunity for reconciliation. And maybe this reconciliation between the two of them didn't come in the best format, i.e. they're cheating on their current spouses, but they were able to come to some understanding. And it's not a moment where you look at them and you say, oh, too little, too late. Because I don't think it is too late. Even if they aren't able to restore their relationship, obviously, they're not really able to change the past. Maybe that sense of closure and that sense of communication and a real moment of intimacy. I mean, I think finally here, 12 years later, 6 hours later in our lives, we are finally witnessing them having a real moment of intimacy where they are connecting and forgiving and understanding and just loving each other in a very simple human way.
I'm going to have to disagree with you here. I viewed the final episode a little more pessimistically, perhaps. Yes, it was beautiful. Yes, everything seemed great, but they were restructuring their relationship on this rotting foundation. The fact that there are all these secrets and lies that surround them, and they're hoping for the best, but isn't that what they were doing at the start of the film? I still think it's Bergman's cynicism showing through again.
It's interesting that we're disagreeing this way, and I think it's kind of poignant as well, because it's really hard to have a conclusive opinion about this series. And I think that's really where it draws its strength and magnetism for viewers, is that it is really such an excellent slice of life that every individual that watches it, especially if they watch the 6-hour version, can find themselves somewhere in there and can tap into feelings of confusion and fear, and abandonment and loneliness or ecstasy and, those kinds of things. And you can't just say it's ABC. It's unfinished, it's unclear, it's human, it's messy, like you said, which is a great term for Bergman's representation of what life really is.
One of the questions that plagued me throughout the film was, why Scenes from a Marriage? This isn't a marriage in itself. It's select moments. In fact, it's roughly a decade of time that Bergman has chosen to represent these two people. In fact, I almost wonder if this film should have been called Scenes from a Marriage Breakdown.
For me, the question was more about the elasticity of it, if you will. At the end of all things, and we know that Bergman is heavily focused on judgment. We see this in previous elements in religion and death and all of those themes that come up. So I'm wondering here is, when all is said and done, if there were an episode 7, I'm wondering how he's expecting that we judge Johan and Marianne. or any wife and husband, are we judged on kind of the continuous performance in a marriage, or are we judged on the individual scenes where we've had an opportunity to shine and be noble, or to really be base and despicable? So are we judged on our growth throughout, or the individual sum of the parts?
In some ways, Sonia, I disagree, because I think that once you gain some distance from a relationship, you often remember the good things about it and forget some of the bad things. But you know, now that I say that, I start to wonder if I fully agree with that. Maybe some of my past relationships, I remember the bad parts, but maybe this is getting a little too personal.
Maybe. That's the strength of Scenes from Marriage, is that it allows you to get really personally connected with this content that he's created. You almost cannot separate yourself from what you're seeing on the screen. And as I said in our previous episode, you get really invested, you get really integrated, and you can't help but recall scenes from your own relationships, from your own conversations with people in your life, and think with a slight tinge of horror at how how similar it is to these two people that are just coming apart at the seams.
Yeah, this definitely, of the Bergman films that we've seen so far, I think resonated the most with my own experiences, and sometimes that was a little bit scary. That brings us to the end of our discussion on Scenes from a Marriage. But if you haven't seen it yet, we have a separate video outlining the details on the miniseries and the theatrical cut, and we also weigh in on which one you should watch first.
Otherwise, please join us for our next episode where we discuss The Magic Flute.
That brings us to the end of this episode of Breaking Down Bergman. Be sure to subscribe to the channel.
And like us on Facebook.
And we will see you next time.